All right, over to you, Josephine.
Thank you so much for having me. Apologize in advance. My voice is not. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so apologies. But I'm going to try my best. I got some tea with me. I'm here today to talk about what we are doing at Storyblok to make the platform a little bit more accessible. And I'm going to take you through what I have been trying to do, what we have kind of on our roadmap to continue that journey. And yeah, there will be plenty of time for questions in the end. I'm super happy to hear that some of you are already partners or users of Storyblok, so that's really, really cool. I'm sure you have lots of great insights, and I'm going to take some notes and also take that back to our development team and product, so we can also, yeah, adapt to user feedback, right? It's something that's really important to me. Really quickly about me, my name's Josephine. I'm Storyblok's dedicated accessibility engineer. I'm also a certified accessibility professional, and you can find me on LinkedIn or write me an email. The slides will also be shared, or I'll share them with Janos for sure afterwards. So if anything comes up, you can always get in touch with me. Might take a day or two, but I'm always eager to respond to you if any questions come up. So what is Storyblok? Storyblok is a headless content management system, meaning that you bring your own front end or you build your own front end in a component style based on atomic design principles usually, and then your editors, your creators can create within a team, can create their content, and it's very flexible. It started out, founded by two developers, right? So we've really had a developer-first mindset when we got started. Now, of course, the company has been growing a lot, so there's a lot more enterprise-ready approach to it, but that's how it started, and I feel like that is still something that drives many decisions as to like what are developers doing or how can we make it developer-friendly to work with. In a nutshell, right? And so the big question that then comes up when I say I'm Storyblok's accessibility engineer is, of course, well, is Storyblok accessible then? And unfortunately, I have to say no. Right now, we are not accessible. When I'm talking about we're going to dive into a little bit more detail what that all covers. But in general, you could say that right now we're not accessible. However, we are working towards it, right? Which is my job, basically. And so when I say we're not accessible, what am I referring to, right? We do have a design system. It is right now published, although we don't keep updating or maintaining it anymore. It's called Blok Inc. I can also share some links with Janos later to include in the blog article. We have a design system. We're using it ourselves, and we have some clients or partners using it. We have our enterprise app. So if you've used Storyblok before, this is where you edit your content. This is where everything comes together, right? And then we have lots of open source projects. We have SDKs that we maintain, and of course we have a website. I kind of excluded that a little bit because I'm not in charge of the website, but we do have that as well. And when I started, unfortunately, none of them were accessible, right? So that's kind of what we were dealing with, or what we are still dealing with. And so those are the different pillars or the things that I'm trying to approach in my work. And currently, or what I got out of doing this for a little bit over a year now is, first of all, the commitment, right? And I think this, for me, when I started out a little bit naively, I thought, well, I mean, if they give me this position, the company must be committed to making Storyblok accessible. That was far off. That was my own mistake. No, of course they are committed, but it was more of it's still a lot of explaining, education, like what does that really mean to become accessible? What do these standards refer to? Of course, not everybody is kind of that deep into the accessibility space. And so we have agreed on becoming compliant towards WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.2 AA standard, which is kind of a middle ground, and which is kind of the baseline which is also going to be used is used as a baseline for the norm in the EU laws that are coming up, right? So we're working towards that as kind of a golden standard. They did commit to having me on board doing this full time and driving all of these improvements, which I think is a big commitment. I haven't seen that from a lot of other competitors necessarily to have somebody who can do this full time. And we do have an accessibility statement on our website now, which we keep adding, and where I also in the long run want to include a more detailed report of what is working, what isn't, what kind of workarounds are there, right? Quite in line with the laws that are also coming up, where we really detail our efforts and show what is working, what is compliant, what is partially compliant, etc. So that's kind of the commitment on the leadership side, if you will. And now if we look at the different aspects that I mentioned earlier, the Storyblok Inc., the design system, the UI, in the app and the website, and then we also, of course, want to enable our customers in the long run to create more accessible content, right? So those are all the different kind of building blocks on that we're working, and I was quite overwhelmed. I'm not gonna lie in the beginning, because there's many different places to create improvements. But where we started now was actually I wanted to start from the ground up, and so that means all the different components in the design system. The design system itself has, I think, 43 components. And when I first started, I started with an audit of the design system, right? And I had a look at, okay, so if we move away from the WCAG criteria and just look at, can I navigate with a keyboard? What does the screen reader announce? So I'm using VoiceOver. What does the screen reader announce when I navigate, for example, to the button? Is there a focus style? Is there a hover style? Do the colors even work? And those were this is already keeping us pretty busy, because it's a legacy project. It grew over time. The design system itself, we have to be honest here, at some point of growth, it was a little bit of a side project. It didn't get all the attention that it would have needed. And so this is what we're doing right now. We want to refactor all the components. We started, for example, with the button, because it was the most used component that we have. And we had a look at, okay, how can we improve the design? Now it's got a proper focus outline. It has a distinct hover style. You can also navigate to the disabled button, which was not possible before. All of these seemingly small things contribute to a component that is used I don't know how many times in our app, right? And this is making all these small fractions of our product already a little bit more accessible. And actually the biggest issue, maybe I can quickly show you what it did look like before. Can I? Yes. Yep. Sorry. Yeah. And so this is the design system we had, or the public version of the design system. And if you know anything about accessibility, you might already stumble across the colors, right? So there used to be the Storyblok brand color with the light teal, which is arguably a really beautiful color, and it has a pop effect. And I love it. However, it doesn't work with white, right? It doesn't have enough color contrast. And also when I tab here, I can't even, I would have to really zoom in to see that there's a focus outline right now. It does have a hover effect, but then if I tab, I can't reach the disabled button. It's fully taken out of the tab order. And all of these were quote unquote small issues, right? But by working with the, I should just get rid of this, yeah. By just working with our UX team and by making these granular improvements, for example, for the button, now we have an accessible button, we have improved the UI and general usability, right? And so we have lots of new variants. Our design team always likes to use this opportunity to then also reevaluate, what are we doing? How can we do it even better? How can we keep it more aligned to our brand standards as well? And yeah, so we go component by component, and we have tackled, I think, 6 or 7 of them. We started with the more complex ones, and then in the upcoming cycle, we'll have a look, for example, at the date picker, something that is notoriously difficult. I could argue to make accessible, but we'll try and make that one accessible. And we have worked in the past on our text field, on our select and drop down, etc. And so we're going bit by bit, trickling down these changes into our own UI. And then once we're done, we'll have a look at our UI and say, hey, okay, so what are the things now that are not included in the design system that we can then have a look at? I don't know, like if you are familiar with Storyblok and our app, you already know we have a visual editor, which is really like one of our biggest selling points. We love the visual editor. We love the interactivity. We love how intuitive it is. But of course, the more interaction you have, the harder it may be to make it accessible and to create experience that work for many different kinds of users, right? And so this will definitely be a challenge coming up, but one that we're really excited about once we are done with all the individual components. And I'm sure, Janus, do you have usually a format where folks ask questions in between? Because if there are any questions already, I'm happy to take them, or I can just go through and then we do it
in the interest of time, if you don't mind, let's move a little bit forward.
Yeah.
Haven't put a lot of things. They haven't put anything in the chat just yet. Nobody's raised their hand, so you're in good shape, Josefine.
Okay, yeah, and then we'll.
This is still working, so we're good.
Okay, perfect. No, of course, then we'll just continue. And one last thing maybe about the design system. The changes are not public right now, but of course the goal is in the end to make all the changes that we are making, the accessible new quote unquote design system, to make this public in the end after all. But just right now, because it will of course create some breaking changes for users who want to make this as smooth as possible, and that's why we're doing it in the background right now, trickling the changes into our own app and then publish the whole thing for everybody in the end when it's really done, to create as little friction as possible. And so I mentioned already with the button, we had some challenges with the original brand colors, right? And so something that I was advocating a lot for was, of course, first of all, we should have a color theme that works for as many people as possible, regardless of having fancy, different dark mode or high contrast modes or any kind of special modes. That's also why we adapted the colors to meet the minimum requirement for color contrast mentioned in WCAG. However, we got to take it even further, and that I was super excited about this because, first of all, creating a product for developers, of course, is a stereotype, but it's one for a reason. Developers love dark mode, and so we were super excited to be able to introduce dark mode. And in addition to that, we were debating a lot with the UX and the design team and saying, okay, what can we do to cover as many visual impairments as possible without having to introduce all these different modes, and it has to work with all the accent colors. And it was really, from a design perspective, really a big challenge to make this work. And the design team and our UX team, they actually produced a light high contrast and light dark contrast, like dark high contrast mode, so that we can cover like as many, or accommodate as many users as possible without having to introduce all these different kind of modes. And of course, it brings some challenges. If you've played around with the different themes, you may have noticed there's still some icons where it's not quite matching, and we're still working on it to make everything super smooth. But the idea I'm really happy with, and I think it's really a good way to create these themes for everybody that everybody can have fun with, but then they also open up a lot more contrast for folks who may need it, right? And so we were really happy with that. And then, of course, this is something that is always super important to our go-to-market team. And like to point out, right, that while it's like, for me, my main job is to make our own UI accessible. That's what my goal, my North Star is, if you will. But in the end, if you're a customer or client of Storyblok, you can, of course, create accessible websites because it's a headless system. So you bring your own technology. You can decide. You have the full control over what you want to do. And that's really, really important because of this decoupled state. It's really possible to do whatever you want in your own front end, and nothing is hindering you to create accessible front ends with Storyblok. So that's always really, really important to point out, of course. And but of course we want to take it further, right? And so we want to really approach this holistically. And my goal is, I've been doing it roughly for a year now, trying to make Storyblok accessible, and it's definitely a lot more political than I could have ever anticipated. It's a big challenge to get everybody on board. There's so many demands also on the product development cycle, right? There's so many different stakeholders, and of course all the different kinds of requests are very important. But what we're trying to do right now is first get the design system components out of the way, especially those that are used quite a lot in our own app. Have a look at the customizations, legacy code. We've all been there, right? There's lots of customizations that have grown over time, where the team is growing, lots of different ideas. And so this was definitely something that's like providing a big challenge to us, that we have sometimes customizations and then the design system is not using the proper component, or it's using a variant of it that is not really represented in the design system. And those are the things that we're trying to smooth out right now. Then from there, we'll move on to our own UI and make our own UI more accessible, especially the more interactive parts of it, like the visual editor. There's a bunch of like drag and drop situations in there that need a lot of attention. And then something that's also really important to me is enabling our customers to create accessible products. And like I mentioned, of course, that's already possible, but we want to provide kind of the guardrails or provide some help in making that smoother, lowering the threshold. And so, for example, we have been working on alt text generation with AI. I don't think, as we speak, it's not released yet. But it will be very, very soon. And that's something that I think is at the click of a button, you can add an alternative text. Of course, it's AI created, so you will have to verify that it's correct, but it makes this a little bit easier and a little less like friction, hopefully, so that people add more alternative text. Because we can always say, oh, but it's so easy. Why don't you just, well, the reality shows it's apparently not that easy, because it's one of the mistakes that gets made, or that aspects that gets overlooked the most, right? And so we figured this would be a really nice feature to introduce to make sure that folks can add it faster if they wanted to. And we're thinking of other features to include there. Of course, it would be nice to have something like an accessible link checker, or something that checks that a link doesn't say click here, or actually contains text that is meaningful. We would love to have something like, or I would love to have something like a tool that helps you have headline hierarchies checked, for example. But again, that's something that we're working with a headless approach, so we would need to figure out how to best do that. And so there's many different aspects in which I think as a CMS we could help our users create accessible content, and we would love to do that. So especially if you have any ideas, I'm getting my pen ready. If you have any ideas or any feature requests, any thoughts, we're really, really open to that. And lastly, of course, the Storyblok website should be accessible, right? Because this is very front-facing and something that is, also really important to our clients. However, the only reason why I'm kind of excluding this also from the presentation is that our app team and our website team, they're two in the organization, they're two separate teams. And I know the website team is considering this, and I have been collaborating with them on it, but it's not in my line of work right now. So that's why I'm kind of excluding it. And that's already basically all from my side.
Perfect also on timing.
Yeah, I tried. I tried to speak really, really fast. So thank you so much.
Well, we do have a question from our one of our Scottish members, David. Do you want to just state it, if you don't mind, David?
So thank you, Josephine. Great presentation. Accessibility is obviously pretty important for all of us right now. But I'm curious. A lot of what you're talking about was kind of component level stuff. Is there any accessibility consideration that you would highlight at a larger scale level of interaction patterns, of how the components don't make the whole user interface, right? They have to sit in the structure of your wider user experience. is there a role for accessibility in that wider user experience design?
I'm not sure if you're referring to something specific or if you had something in mind. The reason why I started with the components is that I noticed that there's, quote unquote, so much wrong with the components already, that if I were to look, like right now, if I look at the app and I look at a specific user flow, which would be something that, like, that's what I want to do next, right? But if I were to go right now and test, like, how does the login flow work, or how does it create a new story, a new content block, on the way, I already know there's so many small things broken that, in my opinion, should be fixed first before I tackle the larger, like the bigger picture. So that's why that's where the approach is coming from. But are you referring to something in particular?
Well, no, I mean, it's just, I mean, I'm in the same place, right? All of my accessibility work right now is focused on making my buttons accessible. I mean,
Yeah.
I simplify, but right. But then there's whole panels, and there's how information is disposed in those panels, and how the navigation system works, and so on. And some of it is obvious, like, you know, contrasted. When we test against microscopic things. But presumably, and I haven't really given it much thought until listening to you today, is presumably there are ways that we can construct panels and navigational elements and so on that are out of accessible components that still nevertheless pose an accessibility problem for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And it's it would be really interesting to look at something like the visual editor, which is fairly complex from a user perspective. Like, I've been working with it for 3 years and I still feel like, wait, where did this button go again? And then of course things change and everything, right? So it's quite interactive. There's many different layers to it, despite the accessibility factor. And so that's something that I'm really excited to get into once the smaller parts are done, because I feel like starting with something this complex will raise so many questions that I'm gonna, like, people who don't have the resources to work on this full time will then, like, I don't know, I feel like it would lose a lot of people and a lot of people's interest also on the way, maybe. Not sure if I was able to express that properly, but
thank you.
It's a good question though.
Let's move from the Highlands to Cambridge. Simon?
Just getting you mute. Hi, thank you, Josephine. That was really interesting. It's good to hear that Storyblok have hired someone to do this full time as well, because you're right, it's not massively common. I know Craft CMS is another example where they have like an on-staff accessibility engineer, but it's not as common as it should be. I guess building, I mean, it sounds like a good approach, starting with the basics and the components and then building up, because as you say, it's kind of a big job. Building a little bit on from what David was saying, it sounds, I mean, ideally, I guess the development approach for new work within Storyblok would eventually change to include accessibility as a consideration. I don't know if other people are starting to do that within Storyblok, or is that not there yet? Or
I try. So what I'm trying to do behind the scenes is infiltrate all the different disciplines, right? So I took to design. I tried to review designs as they're created. I took to the PO team and I try to make sure they consider in any new feature, the guidelines are considered. Of course, things slip through the cracks, absolutely. Like, it's not a perfect system. There are great accessibility champions in different teams. I could never do this all on my own, but it's very, I don't know how to, but it's very difficult to do it all at once. And at the same time, it's important to not only point at the developers, right? Because they're kind of the last ones who get to see something. And so I try to start as early as possible, involve anybody who will listen. But of course, it's not everybody's main focus or priority. So yeah, of course, these things shift around a bit. That's why it's a process, but we do try that. Yeah,
it's hard work. Yeah, that sounds like a good approach.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions, comments, reflections?
I have a quick question, if you wouldn't mind.
Go, Michelle.
If maybe I'm also just wondering, is this the accessibility that you're looking for? Is this to make the platform itself more accessible for users, for developers, or are you also looking into how to make the content creators also more accessible at the end to build better accessible websites Because we're in a similar position too. We, as a content management system, we're going through the whole WCAG guidelines and being like, what can actually help us? What are the tools out there? So are you looking to embed tools into the platform too that can also provide quality checks, accessibility checks?
Yeah, in the long run, that's definitely an idea. Of course, given that we're coming from the headless approach, we want to make sure that the product still focuses on what it's supposed to do and not branches out too much. But I would love to have the option to have, like, we call them apps or extensions that people then can use to check for accessibility before they publish a website, for example. So yeah, absolutely. In the long run, this is an option, and I think a really important one. And like I talked about the AI alternative text, that's something, right, where we try to help our users create more accessible content, but at the same time, I want to make sure that we practice what we preach, and we really also try and stick to the baseline accessibility. And then when you're saying you're also working in content management, right? Like there's also the A tag, so the authoring tool guidelines, which could also be really interesting to consider, or you're probably already doing that, but it's something that we're also thinking about. But then if like Simon said, or David said, if you have to fix the button, then that's the first thing you want to do, and then you move on from there, right? Hope that helps.
Yeah, of course.
Michael?
Thank you.
Then I think the last stop will be Madrid. Michael?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I was not puzzled, but I would like to hear more about the amount of politics that is in accessibility. To me, it seems like a recall from previous years when UXers were talking about lack of sustain from higher management. Are we still in that situation?
Well, I think talking to different accessibility specialists in different companies, it feels like it's definitely a stage. And from what I gathered from folks in UX, yeah, you're now slowly, it's like, for me, it's like UX is the door that I can push through now if I want something, where I say like, oh, but it's also going to improve user experience. Then usually folks start listening, but I feel like it's down the line a little bit. Yeah, so for accessibility, because of course, as a product, it's always looked at what generates new revenue, what do the customers specifically want, what will, in the end, it's a company that needs to survive in this economy, right? So it's not something that sells very easily, and I imagine UX is the same, where you can't, or it's more difficult to prove the immediate financial benefit, for example, that something would generate, and I'm working on that, but it's definitely something where you have to like really advocate for, and it's not.
But
yeah,
somehow, excuse me, somehow
No,
I think that I would think that is just down the road from well, UX is still in strategically free. Accessibility becomes a law by very soon. So I think from a management decision, also there is no UX if there's no accessibility. So just to make things beautiful and work is just not cutting it.
No, I think so too. And I thought the fear, quote unquote, fear of the law would be bigger in general, but everything I heard here also from other people in the EU is that there is not so much stress yet as I thought there would be to meet the guidelines, right? And yeah, so let's see where it leads. Maybe it needs people getting sued. Maybe we'll see what happens. I'm just like, for me, I'm trying to say everything that we do, every step, we're going to be a little bit more accessible, and that's what I'm just going to take that, so step by step. Thank you so much, and we're out of time.
Perfect on time. Thank you, Josefine, for preparing this. Really appreciate it. I'm going to look forward to writing this up and sharing it with everybody. Let's keep the conversation going on accessibility. We are certainly not done yet, but like has been said here by others, really applaud your work, and thanks for sharing with us. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for your time. Bye. If any questions come up after, you can always get in touch with me, right?
Exactly.